Black woman CEO told this is a white-only elevator. 1 minute later, she fired the entire management. Welcome to Dusk Tales. Let's uncover what really happened. The dust of Sovereign Creek was the color of old blood and broken promises. It settled on the raw, unpainted wood of the buildings with a stubborn finality, a fine powder of despair that coated everything, including hope. Serafina James felt it in her throat, a gritty foretaste of the welcome she knew awaited her. She had come to this place not as a conqueror, but as an heir, a fact that the valley, in its ignorant arrogance, could not possibly comprehend. She held the deed in her satchel, a piece of paper that represented her father's life's work, a testament to a former Buffalo soldier who had traded his sword for a surveyor's chain and had, against all odds, carved an empire from this unforgiving land. The Circle S Ranch was hers now, a sprawling kingdom of cattle and creeks that she had never seen, left to her after her father's heart had finally given out in a Denver hotel room. She had come to claim her legacy, a lone, educated black woman stepping into a world that saw her skin color as a brand of inferiority and her gender as a mark of incompetence. The stagecoach left her in the center of the town's single, dusty street. The silence that fell as she stepped down was a physical thing, a heavy, suffocating blanket of judgment. Men on the saloon porch stopped their talking, their eyes hard and assessing. Women pulled their children a little closer, their faces tight with a suspicion that was as old as the hills. Serafina, dressed in a simple but well-made traveling suit, her posture as straight and unyielding as her father's had been, ignored them. She had learned long ago that to acknowledge their contempt was to validate it. Her desolation was not one of poverty or weakness, but of a profound and crushing isolation, a loneliness that was the price of her very existence in a world not built for her. She inquired after a ride to the Circle S, her voice calm and clear, and was met with a dismissive wave toward the livery, a place run by a man who would, she was sure, charge her double. As she walked, the dust swirling around the hem of her skirt, she felt the weight of every stare, the sting of every unspoken slur. This was her inheritance, a vast and beautiful land, surrounded by a moat of hatred. The foreman of the Circle S, a man named Silas Barlow, was a creature of the valley's worst instincts. He was a big man, his guts straining the buttons of his vest, his face floored with whiskey and a petty, self-satisfied cruelty. He had been running the ranch since Serafina's father had grown too ill to manage it from afar, and in that time, he had treated it as his own personal fiefdom, his pockets lined with skimmed profits, his authority absolute. When Serafina arrived at the main gate of the ranch, riding a tired horse from the livery, Barlow looked at her as if she were a piece of dirt that had blown in on the wind. "We ain't hirin'," he said, his voice a lazy, contemptuous drawl, before she had even spoken a word. "Cook's got all the help she needs in the kitchen." Serafina looked at the man, at the sneer on his lips and the lazy confidence in his eyes, and she made a decision. She would not reveal herself. Not yet. She would observe. She would learn the terrain of this new battlefield. "I'm a hard worker," she said, her voice betraying none of the cold fury that was coiling in her stomach. "I can mend clothes. Tend a garden." Barlow grunted, looking her up and down. "Fina, the bunkhouse needs a laundress. You can sleep in the storage shed out back. Don't expect much." He turned and walked away, dismissing her as he would a stray dog. Serafina was led to a small, windowless shed that smelled of damp earth and mice. It was an insult, a deliberate act of debasement. But as she laid out her small bedroll on the dirt floor, she felt not despair, but a cold, clarifying anger. They had mistaken her dignity for weakness, her silence for submission. It was a mistake they would come to regret. In the days that followed, she moved through the ranch like a ghost, her eyes and ears open. She washed the sweat-stiffened clothes of the ranch hands, her hands, accustomed to ink and ledgers, growing rough and chapped. She saw the waste, the neglect, the casual cruelty of Barlow's reign. She saw the fear in the eyes of the other hands, men who were too beaten down or too indebted to challenge his authority. And she saw Gideon. He was the horse wrangler, a man who seemed to belong more to the canyons than to the company of men. He was a widower, a man haunted by a past the other hands whispered about but never dared mention to his face. He moved with a quiet, coiled stillness, his hands gentle with the horses, his eyes holding a deep, abiding sorrow. He was the only one who did not look through her. He would meet her gaze with a quiet, respectful nod. He would leave a bucket of fresh, clean water outside her shed in the mornings. He offered no words, only these small, silent gestures of decency. They were a lifeline in the suffocating sea of contempt. He saw her, not as a laundress, not as a black woman, but as a person. And in the desolate landscape of Serafina's new life, that small act of recognition was a rescue, a single, steady flame in the encroaching dark. The bond between Serafina and Gideon was forged in the silent, shared language of outcasts. It was a connection built not on words, but on the solid ground of mutual respect. He saw the intelligence that burned behind her quiet, observant eyes, the unyielding strength in the set of her shoulders as she endured the daily humiliations of her station. She saw the deep well of honor that lay beneath his stoic, guarded exterior, the gentle way his rough hands could calm a spooked mare, the profound loneliness in his gaze when he thought no one was watching. They rarely spoke, but their communication was constant. When she saw him struggling to splint the leg of a foal, she approached with a quiet confidence, her knowledge of anatomy, gleaned from her father's old veterinary books, surprising him with its depth and precision. Together, they worked in a seamless, unspoken partnership, their hands moving in a synchronized rhythm of care. In return, when he saw her struggling to haul a heavy basket of wet laundry, he would appear, as if from nowhere, take it from her without a word, and carry it to the line. Their alliance did not go unnoticed. The other ranch hands, accustomed to the rigid hierarchy of Barlow's rule, watched with a mixture of confusion and a grudging, nascent respect. They saw that Gideon, the most formidable and respected man on the ranch, treated the new laundress as an equal. It was a small, subtle shift in the ranch's power dynamics, but a shift nonetheless. Silas Barlow saw it too, and it curdled the whiskey in his gut. He saw Gideon's quiet deference to Serafina as a personal affront, a challenge to his own authority. He couldn't comprehend a respect that wasn't born of fear. He decided to put an end to it, to reestablish the natural order of his world with a public display of his absolute power. The opportunity came during the annual Cattlemen's Banquet, a lavish affair Barlow hosted at the ranch to solidify his standing among the region's powerful ranchers. The main house, a place Serafina had never been allowed to enter, was ablaze with light. The air was filled with the sound of loud laughter, cigar smoke, and the clinking of glasses. Serafina was ordered to work in the kitchen, a hot, suffocating space filled with the frantic energy of the cook and her two helpers. Late in the evening, after the main course had been served, Barlow, flushed with whiskey and self-importance, strode into the kitchen. He was flanked by two of the visiting cattle barons, their faces smug and arrogant. "We need more wine for the owner's table," Barlow bellowed, his eyes sweeping the room with casual contempt. He looked past the cook, past the other helpers, and his gaze landed on Serafina. "You," he said, pointing a thick finger at her. "Bring a bottle of the French red from the cellar. And be quick about it." It was a deliberate, calculated insult. He was using her as a servant in front of these powerful men, reinforcing her lowly status. Serafina met his gaze, her expression unreadable. She said nothing, simply wiped her hands on her apron, and went to the cellar. She returned with the dusty bottle, her movements graceful and composed. She walked through the swinging doors and into the main dining hall. The room was a tableau of wealth and power. Men in expensive suits sat around a long, mahogany table, their faces florid, their laughter loud and self-congratulatory. This was the owner's table, the seat of power in the valley. Serafina walked to the head of the table, where Barlow sat holding court. She placed the bottle of wine on the white linen tablecloth. As she was about to turn and leave, Barlow grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. "Not so fast," he sneered, his voice loud enough for the entire table to hear. "Pour the wine. Let's see if you can manage that without spilling it." The men at the table chuckled. It was a cruel, casual display of power, a man demonstrating his ownership of everything and everyone in the room. Serafina did not flinch. She looked at his hand on her arm, then up at his face, and her voice, when she spoke, was quiet, but it cut through the noise of the room like a shard of ice. "Take your hand off me," she said. Barlow's eyes widened, a flash of surprise followed by a surge of rage. "What did you say to me?" he growled, his grip tightening. "This is the owner's table, girl. You are here to serve. You will do as you are told." "I am aware that this is the owner's table," Serafina replied, her voice still impossibly calm. "And I will not be serving you, or anyone else at this table. In fact," she paused, her gaze sweeping over the stunned, silent faces of the cattle barons, "I'm going to have to ask you all to leave." A wave of incredulous laughter went around the table. Barlow's face turned a deep, apoplectic purple. "Who in the hell do you think you are?" he roared. "My name," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound, absolute authority, "is Serafina James. My father was Solomon James. And this," she looked from Barlow's stunned face to the opulent room, to the vast lands that stretched beyond the windows. "This is my table. This is my house. And you, Mr. Barlow, are fired." She pulled a folded, notarized document from the pocket of her apron. The deed to the Circle S Ranch. She laid it on the table, on the pristine white linen, next to the dusty bottle of French wine. The silence that followed was absolute, profound, and devastating. The balance of power in the valley had not just shifted. It had been shattered. In the back of the room, standing in the shadows by the kitchen door, Gideon watched, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to smile. The revolution at the Circle S Ranch was swift and bloodless. The cattle barons, men who understood the language of power and ownership above all else, were the first to grasp the magnitude of the change. They looked from the deed on the table, to Barlow's ashen, crumbling face, to the calm, commanding presence of the woman they had, moments before, seen as nothing more than a servant. They rose from the table, their apologies a clumsy, stumbling cascade of self-preservation. Serafina accepted their retreat with a cool, regal nod. She was not interested in their apologies. She was interested in restoring order. Barlow, his world collapsing around him, was speechless. He stared at Serafina, his mind unable to process the reality of his own spectacular downfall. He had been undone not by a rival rancher or a corporate raider, but by the quiet, overlooked woman he had tried to break. "Get him off my property," Serafina said, her voice quiet but carrying the unmistakable weight of command. Gideon stepped forward from the shadows. He did not touch Barlow. He simply stood beside him, his presence a silent, unassailable authority. Barlow, a broken man, stumbled from the room, from the house, from the life he had stolen, without a single backward glance. The war was over. The rebuilding began the next morning. Serafina, dressed not in a servant's apron, but in a practical, well-made riding skirt and boots, called a meeting of all the ranch hands. They gathered in the main yard, their faces a mixture of fear, confusion, and a dawning, fragile hope. She stood on the porch of the main house, the deed in her hand. "My name is Serafina James," she announced, her voice carrying across the yard. "This ranch belonged to my father, Solomon James, and now it belongs to me. Things are going to be different around here." She laid out her new terms: fair wages, decent living conditions, and a share in the profits for every hand who worked honestly and hard. She spoke of her father's vision, a vision of a ranch built not on fear and exploitation, but on mutual respect and shared labor. She then turned and looked at Gideon, who stood slightly apart from the other men. "I will need a foreman," she said, "a man I can trust, a man of honor. That man is Gideon." A murmur of approval went through the assembled hands. Gideon, who had never sought power, who had been a quiet outsider himself, was a leader they would willingly follow. He looked at Serafina, a thousand unspoken emotions passing between them: gratitude, respect, and the beginning of something more. He stepped forward and stood by her side, a silent pledge of his loyalty. In the weeks that followed, Serafina, with Gideon as her trusted partner, began the arduous process of untangling the mess Barlow had made. She brought in an accountant from Denver, a sharp, no-nonsense man who had worked for her father for years. Together, they went through the ledgers, uncovering a web of theft and corruption that was staggering in its scope. Barlow had not just been skimming profits. He had been systematically selling off ranch assets, mortgaging the land, and driving the Circle S to the brink of bankruptcy. The evidence was undeniable. Barlow was arrested, his reign of petty tyranny ending not with a bang, but with the quiet click of a sheriff's handcuffs. Serafina and Gideon worked from sunrise to sunset, rebuilding the ranch from the ground up. They were a formidable team. Her sharp, strategic mind, honed by years of education, was the perfect complement to his deep, practical knowledge of the land and the animals. They repaired the fences, restocked the herds, and renegotiated the contracts with the cattle buyers, their partnership transforming the neglected ranch into a thriving, efficient enterprise. The bond between them deepened with each passing day. It was a love story written in the language of shared labor and quiet, evening conversations on the porch of the main house. He told her of the wife and child he had lost to a fever, of the grief that had driven him into the solitary wilderness of his own heart. She told him of her father, of the loneliness of her life in the East, of her dream to build something of her own, to honor her father's legacy on her own terms. One evening, as the sun set, painting the vast sky in shades of rose and gold, he took her hand. "I spent years thinking my life was over," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "I was just a ghost, haunting the edges of the world. You, Serafina, you brought me back into the light. And you, Gideon," she replied, her voice soft, "you were the only one who saw me when I was a ghost myself." He pulled a small, hand-carved object from his pocket. It was a bird, its wings spread wide, its form so intricate and beautiful it seemed alive. "My father made this," she whispered, recognizing the same skill, the same spirit in Gideon's work. "I make them when I'm trying to find my way," he said. I think I've found it." The town of Sovereign Creek, witnessing the quiet, miraculous resurrection of the Circle S, began to change. They saw the fair wages, the new prosperity, the quiet dignity with which Serafina ran her empire. They saw the honor and strength of her partnership with Gideon, and they were forced to confront the ugliness of their own prejudice. The respect they now showed her was genuine, hard-won, and all the more meaningful for it. Serafina James had not just claimed her inheritance. She had redeemed it. She had taken a place defined by corruption and fear and had transformed it into a community. She and Gideon, two solitary souls who had been cast out by the world, had found each other in the dust and the silence, and together they had built a sanctuary. The wind that now blew through the valley no longer whispered of endings. It carried the scent of fresh-cut hay, the sound of laughter from the bunkhouse, and the promise of a future that was as vast and as bright as the western sky.